In this video, I'm going to derive the formula for the derivative of the inverse sine function by applying the inverse function theorem. That theorem says that if f and g are inverses, then f prime of x is equal to 1 over g prime of f of x. So in this case, we've got f of x is the inverse sine of x, and g of x is equal to sine of x. They're inverse functions. So the first thing we need to do is to find g prime of x. The derivative of sine is cosine. But we don't want g prime of x, we want g prime of f of x. So we're going to find g prime of f of x, which will be cosine of f of x. But f of x is the inverse sine of x, so we get cosine of the inverse sine of x. Now at this point, what we're going to do is to evaluate what is the inverse sine of x. You might recall from trigonometry that inverse trig functions are angles. So I'm going to label this as angle theta, and then we're going to draw a right triangle and illustrate that in our right triangle. So in the right triangle, I'm going to label one of the acute angles as theta, and then up here at the top, I'm going to remind myself that theta is equal to the inverse sine of x, but that means that the sine of theta is equal to x. And we can write x as a fraction. We can write it as x over 1. And then we recall that in a right triangle, the sine of theta is the opposite side over the hypotenuse. So I'm going to label the opposite side as x and the hypotenuse as 1. Then we can determine the length of the adjacent side using the Pythagorean theorem. We know that this leg squared plus x squared is going to equal 1 squared. So that means that the adjacent side is the square root of 1 minus x squared. We want to figure out the cosine of the angle. So now I'm going to write cosine of theta, and that is adjacent over hypotenuse. Our adjacent side is the square root of 1 minus x squared, and the adjacent side, the hypotenuse is 1. So we get the square root of 1 minus x squared over 1, and that just simplifies to the square root of 1 minus x squared. So the cosine of the inverse sine of x is the square root of 1 minus x squared. So now we're ready to find what is the derivative of inverse sine of x. Well, we just need to take the reciprocal of g prime of f of x. So f prime of x is equal to 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared. So in summary, the derivative of the inverse sine of x is equal to 1 over the square root of 1 minus x squared.